Darkness. A low, pulsing hum. A whisper, like paper tearing inside your skull. They tried to bury it. They tried to hide it behind manila envelopes, brittle paper, neat handwriting that pretended to mean nothing. But the truth was never lost. It was waiting, silent, patient, like a disease that knows your blood better than you do. In 1983, at the Colorado State Hospital, someone found a sealed envelope hidden at the back of a forgotten cabinet. No label, no case number, no obvious reason for its existence. Inside, 12 index cards. Each card carried a name, a birth date, and one haunting phrase. Subject, observation continues. 6 of those cards were marked in red, 6 were not. No explanation, no report, just a line, an invisible wall between those who would be consumed and those who would survive. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if the person who wrote it knew these cards were not ordinary records but warnings, fragments of something unspeakable. On the back of each card, 2 words, short phrases, cryptic commands. Observation escalates, intervention deferred, compliance partial, like messages from another language, half-coded, meant only for insiders. And then, silence. The cards were left to rot in the dark. They were never supposed to be opened, but someone did. And when the envelope was unsealed, the story of the Galvin family began to bleed into the light. This is not a story about rumors, not speculation. What you're about to hear was pulled from medical logs, police reports, testimony, and memories that survivors would rather have burned. This is the story of 12 children, born into a house that looked like every other American dream, but was in truth an experiment in something far darker, something genetic, something systemic, something that reveals how deep the rot inside our institutions really goes. The Galvins lived on Hidden Valley Road in Colorado Springs. A father, a mother, and 12 children, 10 boys, 2 girls. To neighbors, they looked like the model Catholic family. Sunday Mass, sharp haircuts, pressed clothes, polite smiles. The father, Donald Galvin, was a military man, polished and disciplined. The mother, Mimi, was devout, orderly, obsessed with perfection. On the surface, they were untouchable. But appearances are a weapon. They are the mask a system wears to keep you from asking questions. Behind the neat lawn, behind the falconry gloves and polished shoes, madness was breeding. Not a metaphorical madness, not just dysfunction. A literal genetic plague, running like wildfire through bloodlines, devouring the minds of 6 brothers, leaving the others scarred in silence. Schizophrenia, violence, delusion, abuse, suicide, murder. A family cursed not by superstition, but by biology, and abandoned by every institution that could have helped them. Science would later call them a genetic goldmine. A once-in-a-century concentration of psychiatric collapse inside a single family. Doctors descended on their DNA like vultures, studying them, dissecting them, extracting data. To the medical establishment, the Galvins were not people. They were specimens, living laboratories. Their suffering was catalogued, studied, and quietly exploited. But here's the part no one tells you. The Galvin family wasn't just an accident of genetics. Their tragedy reveals something larger, something that institutions never want to admit, that madness, control, and silence are tools, that families like this are not just unfortunate, they are useful. Think about it. A father broken by war, carrying PTSD before it had a name, a mother indoctrinated into rigid Catholic ideals of silence and submission, 12 children raised in an environment where appearances mattered more than truth. Into this house came violence, psychosis, and abuse, and yet no police reports, no investigations, no interventions. Neighbors heard screams, teachers saw signs, doctors glimpsed the cracks, but everyone turned away. Why? Because the mask was more valuable than the truth. Because in America, order is prized over reality. Because the system needs silence to keep functioning. And so, while 6 brothers spiraled into schizophrenia, each in his own horrific way, their pain was hidden. Their violence was absorbed by the family, their crimes unreported, their suffering untreated until it was too late. 6 brothers lost to madness, 6 siblings forced to survive inside the wreckage. This is the descent we begin tonight, and I warn you, once you step into this, you will not come back the same. Because this is not just about one family in Colorado. This is about what happens when truth is suppressed. when institutions turn people into experiments, when silence becomes a weapon. The Galvin house was not a home. It was a theater where control played its cruelest trick, where love was replaced by order, where discipline masked abuse, where madness was hidden in plain sight. And if you think this story belongs to the past, think again. The same silence, the same control, the same eye. Institutional manipulation still surrounds you now. You've just been trained not to see it. This is only the beginning. You must understand something about men who return from war. They don't always come home. Sometimes their body steps back across the threshold, but their mind never leaves the battlefield. Donald Galvin was one of those men. He fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II. The final stages, the brutal islands where combat was so intimate, so animal, that death was not just statistics but breath, blood, and bone. He watched men burn. He watched bodies stacked like cordwood. And though the military never gave it a name then, the truth is he carried trauma so corrosive it rewired him forever. After the war, Donald entered the new branch of the U.S. military, the Air Force, and began teaching at the academy in Colorado. To the public, he was disciplined, respectable, honorable. He didn't drink, he didn't beat his children, he wasn't explosive. But silence can be as violent as rage. Withdrawal can suffocate a family as effectively as fists. Donald did not nurture his children, he did not guide them, he organized them, he managed them as if they were troops under command. 12 children, numbered more often than named. 4, stand here. 6, clean that. 8, report to your room. To him, they were units, functions, a system to keep order in a house that would otherwise collapse under its own size. And yet, it did collapse, because beneath his surface control was something far more dangerous. An emotional absence so total it hollowed the family from the inside out. When a father cannot connect, when he is a stone wall instead of a presence, the children grow in shadows. They fight for identity, for recognition, for scraps of attention. In that void, seeds of madness take root. But Donald was not alone in constructing this prison of order. His wife, Mimi, was the other architect. She had dreamed once of a life in New York, cultured, alive with ambition. Instead, she was bound to a military man in Colorado, raising 12 children in the suffocating expectations of Catholic devotion. She traded her dreams for doctrine, and she enforced it with iron ritual. Mimi believed order could save them. Ironed napkins, polished shoes, a spotless floor. 12 children marched into church like soldiers on parade. Nothing out of line, nothing uncontrolled, nothing that would betray the chaos behind closed doors. But what do you think happens when children cry in silence and their mother responds not with comfort but with stricter rules? When bruises are explained away as boxing practice, when screams are muffled by new curtains and replaced windows, you don't get peace. You get a masquerade. You get a theater of stability where madness festers beneath the stage. Neighbors noticed. They heard glass shattering, bodies slamming, voices rising to screams. They watched as boys brawled on the lawn, fists splitting lips, eyes swelling shut. But no police were ever called, because Mimi would not allow it. Appearances were everything. Shame was worse than violence. Exposure was the true enemy, and so she created rituals of silence. When one child broke down, she tightened the schedule. When one child grew violent, she explained it away. When one child showed signs of psychosis, she told the others, "He's just high-strung. He just needs time." The sickness was not acknowledged, it was buried. But burying does not erase, it incubates. By the 1960s, inside the Galvin home, 6 children were already beginning to show early signs of schizophrenia. Not that the family would use that word. It was a word that could damn them, a word that could destroy their mask. Instead, they carried on. The older boys began displaying violent tendencies, animal cruelty, self-destructive rituals, violent rages. Still, there were no doctors, no therapists, just silence, boxing gloves, and falconry. Yes, falconry, their strange family pastime, training wild birds, tethering them, controlling their flight. It was Mimi's idea of discipline. But look closely, isn't that the perfect metaphor? Wildness shackled by leather straps, flight reduced to ritual, nature bent into control. What the parents did to the falcons, they were doing to their children. And so the home became a pressure cooker. 10 boys, 2 girls, a mother obsessed with order, and a father who had become a ghost. The girls, Margaret and Mary, would grow up like shadows, tiptoeing between landmines, watching as their brothers descended into something unspeakable. But here is the truth that no one in polite Colorado Springs wanted to see. The Galvin family was not cursed. They were not unlucky. They were a mirror, a reflection of what happens when trauma goes untreated, when institutions fail, when silence becomes law. Donald came back from war with wounds that no one dared name. Mimi raised children with rules that smothered rather than saved. And into that crucible came something written in their very blood: genetic schizophrenia, a disease that can shatter a mind before adulthood, leaving only fragments of the person that was. The Galvin family would become a case study in psychiatry, their DNA dissected, their suffering mined for data. But do you think that helped them? Do you think the doctors came to heal them? No. The medical establishment came to harvest them. Because for scientists, they were not a tragedy. They were an opportunity. Remember this: when institutions look at you, they don't see a soul. They see a statistic. They see potential data points, possible breakthroughs, leverage for control. The Galvin children were not rescued. They were recorded. Their suffering was not alleviated. It was catalogued. And in that gap between what science promises and what it delivers lies the same truth that defined their family: silence. The silence of a father who could not speak his pain. The silence of a mother who refused to admit the cracks. The silence of siblings who endured violence and abuse without language to name it. The silence of neighbors who looked the other way. And the silence of institutions who studied instead of saving. The Galvins lived in silence, and silence more than madness is what destroyed them. But you need to hear this: the silence is not gone. It's around you right now. Every institution you trust, military, church, medical, government, relies on your silence, your willingness to accept the mask instead of tearing it away. The Galvin home is gone, but the system that let it exist, that system is still alive, and it's watching you. The first to break was Donald Jr., the firstborn, the golden child, the proof to the outside world that the Galvin family's discipline had worked. He was strong, athletic, sharp. Football, wrestling, leadership. Teachers praised him. Coaches admired him. To neighbors, he was the prototype of the American son, disciplined, competitive, destined for success. But masks always crack, and Don Jr.'s began to crack in silence. It started with small things. Strange stares at the dinner table, his eyes locking onto a single point, unblinking, for minutes at a time. Long silences after simple questions, as though words had become too heavy to carry. Subtle disconnections that no one around him wanted to acknowledge. Mimi brushed it off as moods. His father ignored it. The brothers teased him. But behind his silence was the early onset of something much darker: schizophrenia. A disease that doesn't arrive like lightning but seeps like oil into the mind, spreading slowly until the person you knew becomes a stranger. In college, the mask began to tear completely. At a university bonfire, Don Jr. suddenly leapt without reason, without hesitation, directly into the flames. He emerged burned, laughing, not with joy, but with that chilling detachment you only hear in someone whose mind is drifting from reality. He offered no explanation. He gave no reason. He just laughed, and then went silent. Later, in his dorm room, he strangled a cat, methodically, slowly, and when his roommate found the box hidden beneath the sink, containing the small broken body, Don Jr. gave only one answer: "It means nothing. Nothing." That is the most terrifying response you can imagine, because it wasn't rage, it wasn't cruelty in the conventional sense, it was emptiness. The abyss looking back through human eyes. No one reported it. The school didn't intervene. His family didn't seek help. This is the pattern that defines the Galvin story. Every warning ignored, every red flag explained away until it's too late. Don Jr. drifted further. He began rearranging the house in bizarre ways, removing all the furniture from the living room and stacking it outside in the yard silently, piece by piece, as if obeying some private instruction no one else could hear. He poured salt into the aquarium, killing the fish, then walked away without a word. His parents called it stress. His professors called it distraction. The truth was, schizophrenia had already begun to devour his mind. But still, no diagnosis, no treatment, no action. One night, Don Jr. stood in the kitchen, silent, and began smashing ceramic plates. Not in a rage, not throwing, but slowly. One plate, shattered, a pause, then another, then another. 10 plates, each one broken with deliberate precision. His siblings watched in silence. His mother cleaned the pieces. His father did not speak. Do you see it yet? The silence. Always the silence. The first real break came when Don Jr. tried to kill his wife. He forced her to inhale cyanide fumes. Only then was he taken away, arrested, evaluated, finally given a word that had been stalking him for years: paranoid schizophrenia. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The diagnosis was not the beginning of healing. It was confirmation of collapse. For the family, it should have been a warning, but it wasn't. Because in the end, who had a tea house, they couldn't afford warnings. To admit one child was sick was to admit the mask had cracked, to admit their blood carried something incurable, to admit their silence had allowed it to fester. Instead, they carried on. And while they carried on, the other brothers, 9 of them still in the house, were watching, absorbing, spiraling. Madness spreads in silence. When no one names it, it multiplies. James was next. He married young, had a child, seemed stable for a while, but the voices came. Whispers, warnings, invisible observers. He turned violent, beating his wife, accusing her of conspiracies. Later, it would emerge that during his psychosis he molested his younger sisters. The family kept it quiet. Again, silence. Then Brian, outwardly stable, even charming. He moved to California, fell in love, but when his relationship ended, he snapped. One night, he killed his girlfriend with a .22 caliber gun, then turned it on himself, a murder-suicide. Police filed it away. The family buried the truth. Do you see the pattern? Every time the madness surfaced, it was not met with intervention. It was not met with confrontation. It was absorbed, buried, reframed as just another symptom, just another sad accident. No one would admit the larger truth. 6 brothers were slipping into psychosis, one by one. Matthew, head trauma from a violent fight with Joseph. Afterward, delusions consumed him. He believed he was Paul McCartney, claimed he'd written songs he couldn't recall performing. He smashed gifts in front of friends, stripped naked without explanation. Peter, brilliant, but unraveling, wetting himself uncontrollably, insisting the devil lived beneath the house. Electroshock therapy was forced on him by court order. He spent the rest of his life sedated, haunted by voices that never stopped. Joseph, the most tragic, the most aware. He could tell what was real and what wasn't, but he couldn't stop the visions. Chinese emperors in the clouds, past lives whispering commands. He sent threats to his employer under the orders of voices he couldn't silence, and he confessed something that shattered the last illusion. He had been sexually abused by a trusted Catholic priest. His illness wasn't just genetic, it was fed. 6 brothers, 6 collapses. Each in their own way, they fell into madness, murder, suicide, abuse, delusion, violence, and still no one outside the house saw it for what it was. No one inside named it. The doctors didn't heal them. The church didn't protect them. The family didn't save them. Instead, their lives were documented, categorized, and filed away. A genetic study. A unique opportunity. But tell me, what is the difference between treatment and experimentation, between helping and harvesting? When psychiatrists came to the Galvins, were they rescuing them, or were they using them? Because here is the truth. The Galvins were never healed. They were never given peace. They were mined. Their DNA was taken. Their suffering became data, and the institutions walked away with studies, publications, prestige, and the family. They were left with silence. Again, the tragedy of Don Jr. was not that he fell, it's that his fall was allowed, watched, documented, ignored until it could no longer be hidden, and what happened to him would happen again, and again, and again, because when silence reigns, madness multiplies. While the world stared at the collapsing brothers, few stopped to look at the sisters. The 6 Galvin daughters, Margaret, Mary, Teresa, and the younger ones, especially Lindsay, were told to stay quiet, to keep their heads down, to endure. In a house where the men were exploding into violence, the girls became shadows, moving silently through the corridors, learning to disappear before the madness found them. But silence can't protect you, not from your own family. One of the brothers, James, had already grown violent with his wife, But what no one outside the home knew was that he had turned on his sisters too. When the psychosis overtook him, when the voices whispered in his ear, he assaulted them. He violated their trust, their safety, their very bodies. Lindsay Galvin, the youngest sister, would later reveal that James molested her. For years, she carried the memory like a shard of glass buried under her skin. No one in the family believed her at the time, or perhaps they believed her too much and chose silence. In that house, silence was survival. But the abuse wasn't confined to James. Later, more truths emerged. Joseph, already slipping into delusions, confessed his own dark impulses, that in his illness, he too had molested. The girls had lived not just in a house of madness, but in a house where the madness turned predatory. And here is the part that will make your blood run cold. The family still didn't talk. The daughters, already minimized in a house dominated by 12 sons, were told to bury the truth, to forget, to forgive, to stay silent. It is easy to say in hindsight that the parents should have done more, that the church should have intervened, that someone, anyone, should have protected them. But the reality is darker. The abuse was systemic. It wasn't just brothers turning on sisters, it was priests turning on children. Because Joseph, the brother who spoke of visions of Chinese emperors, who threatened his boss under the influence of voices, was also the one who revealed a devastating truth. He had been sexually abused by a trusted Catholic priest. A man meant to guide him spiritually had preyed upon him. Think about the weight of that revelation. Imagine being a boy already haunted by whispers in your mind, already confused by reality, already shamed by behaviors you didn't understand, then being told by a holy man, the voice of God on earth, that your body wasn't yours, that your suffering was righteous, that silence was sacred. The madness in the Galvin family wasn't just biology, it was fed. It was nurtured by predators who understood the power of silence. And still, the institutions failed them, the church hushed it, the doctors clinicalized it. The parents, overwhelmed, locked it away. Everyone reduced the Galvins to a case study, a genetic anomaly, a curiosity. But to the sisters, it was life. Every day, survival meant dodging the violent mood swings of their brothers, the groping hands of psychosis, the crushing indifference of parents who couldn't afford to admit the full truth. One by one, they fled. Lindsay escaped as soon as she could. Teresa built her own world, but the trauma followed them like a shadow. When Lindsay began therapy years later, she confessed what James had done, and for the first time, she was believed. Imagine the flood of that moment. Decades of silence breaking, the words finally spoken aloud. But here is the cruelest part. By then, it was too late. James was gone. Brian was gone. Joseph was gone. 3 brothers dead. By suicide, by violence, by illness. The chance for justice had died with them. And still the sisters carried the weight. The outside world, meanwhile, was fascinated not by their suffering, but by their DNA. Doctors descended upon the family like vultures. 6 brothers with schizophrenia in one household. It was a miracle for research. They drew blood. They took brain scans. They catalogued everything. The Galvin family became the most studied case in American psychiatric history. Their genes, their suffering, their deaths, all of it fed into what would become one of the most significant discoveries about schizophrenia, the role of a gene known as C4, linked to immune system overactivity that prunes the brain synapses too aggressively, triggering psychosis. For science, it was revolutionary. For the Galvins, it was confirmation. They were not cursed, they were not possessed, they were not simply weak. They were carrying something coded into their very cells. But let me ask you, does knowing the name of the gene make the pain easier? Does it undo the abuse? Does it bring back Brian's girlfriend killed in a murder-suicide? Does it give Lindsay back the childhood stolen from her? The answer is no. The science mattered to the world. But to the Galvins, it was just another way in which their suffering was consumed by others, studied and never healed. Because even as their blood revealed secrets about the human mind, the family remained fractured. Don Jr. institutionalized, James violent until the end, Peter electroshocked into submission, Joseph sedated until he could no longer distinguish dream from waking, and the sisters, scarred, traumatized, yet resilient. Because while the men collapsed, it was the women who carried the truth forward. It was Lindsay, in particular, who chose not to remain silent. She spoke to doctors, she gave testimony, She told the story in full, including the parts that no one wanted to hear, the abuse, the neglect, the silence. She refused to let the narrative be reduced to just genetics. Her voice cut through the silence. And that is why we know their story today. But here is the lingering question. Was the Galvin family destroyed by a genetic curse, or by the weight of a society that chose to look away? Because the truth is this: schizophrenia is not an isolated disease. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It thrives where there is neglect. It worsens when silence suffocates. It metastasizes when abuse festers unchecked. The Galvin brothers did not just inherit madness. They inherited silence. They inherited a world where priests could molest, fathers could ignore, doctors could exploit, and mothers could clean broken plates without asking why. And in that silence, madness was not just born, it was raised. The Galvin house is still standing. From the outside, it looks ordinary. White paint, clean windows, an echo of the American dream. Neighbors pass by without a second glance. Children ride bikes past the lawn. Birds perch on the roofline, oblivious to the ghosts inside. But if you know the story, you can't look at that house without feeling the weight. 12 children, 6 broken by schizophrenia, 6 forced into survival, abuse hidden, deaths unspoken, a family consumed. When journalist Robert Kolker published Hidden Valley Road, the full truth poured out into the public. For the first time, the family's private hell was written plainly. The psychotic breaks, the molestation, the silence. It was like opening a coffin that had been sealed for 50 years. The stench of everything buried spilled into the air. The world reacted with fascination. Readers devoured the book, stunned that such a family could exist. Hollywood circled, planning dramatizations. Scientists hailed the story as a milestone in psychiatric history, proof that schizophrenia's roots lay in both genes and trauma. But here's the paradox. The more the Galvin story was consumed, the less it seemed to belong to them. Their name became shorthand for the family with schizophrenia. Their pain became spectacle. Their memories became research material. For the sisters, it was like being trapped again, this time not inside a house with violent brothers, but inside a narrative shaped by others. Everyone wanted the Galvins to symbolize something. Few wanted to sit with the raw, unvarnished truth. And yet the sisters refused to surrender their voices. Lindsay especially stepped forward. She spoke about the abuse. She spoke about the silence. She forced the world to see that this was not only about genetics, it was about how families fracture under the weight of shame. In interviews, she described her childhood as a war zone. Every day was survival. Every moment could turn violent. And yet, she endured. She carried the trauma into adulthood, yes, but she also carried a determination to name what others had buried. Because naming is power. Naming breaks silence. That is the legacy of the Galvins, not just the discovery of the C4 gene, not just the research breakthroughs in synaptic pruning, not just the medical papers and Nobel-worthy insights. Their legacy is this: that truth, no matter how suffocating, cannot be silenced forever. But here is the haunting question that lingers when the story ends. Was it worth it? Was the suffering of 6 brothers, the suicides, the violence, the abuse of sisters, the silence of parents, was all of that worth the scientific progress? Was it worth finding a piece of the puzzle that might someday cure schizophrenia? Science would say yes. Progress always demands sacrifice. That is the brutal calculus of research. For every breakthrough, there are bodies in the shadows. But families are not equations. They are not laboratories. They are flesh and blood. And when you listen closely to the Galvin story, you hear not triumph, but mourning. You hear the sound of a mother scrubbing floors while her son raves in psychosis. You hear the silence of sisters who were told to forget. You hear the locked doors, the broken plates, the muffled sobs behind closed walls. You hear, in other words, the sound of America's silence, because the Galvins were not unique. They were extreme, yes, but not alone. Countless families suffer in silence, trapped between stigma, religion, institutional neglect, and the crushing weight of untreated mental illness. The Galvins simply became visible because their suffering was too large to ignore. But for every family like theirs, how many others rot unseen? How many others are still silenced by shame? How many others are still preyed upon by predators in the church, in schools, in homes, while neighbors look away? That is the real horror of the Galvin family story. It's not just about 12 children on Hidden Valley Road. It's about the machinery of silence that exists everywhere, a machinery that devours truth, generation after generation, until someone breaks. And when someone breaks, the world points and whispers, "Look at the madman, look at the cursed family, look at the tragedy." But they never ask the harder question, what made the silence possible? The Galvin family's suffering exposed more than a genetic curse. It revealed a culture of repression, a system where appearances matter more than safety, where institutions protect themselves instead of the vulnerable, where silence is more valuable than truth. And it forces us to confront an unbearable reality, that madness does not only live in the brain. Madness lives in silence, madness lives in denial, madness lives in every whispered secret that festers until it explodes. So when you walk away from this story, don't just remember the Galvins as the schizophrenic family. Remember them as a mirror held up to us all. Ask yourself, what silences are you complicit in? What truths have you chosen not to see? What screams have you ignored because they were muffled behind respectable walls? Because if there's one lesson the Galvin family leaves us, it is this: silence is never neutral. Silence is always a weapon. And when silence takes root, it devours everything, until all that remains are fragments, case files, and index cards marked in red. That's what the envelope at the hospital really was. Not just a record, not just data. It was the fossil of silence, a reminder that what is hidden will rot in the dark, but it will not stay buried forever. The Galvin's truth was always going to escape. The only question was how much blood it would cost. And now, you've heard it too. You've carried their silence for a moment. You've seen behind the mask. So tell me, do you feel it? The unease? The weight pressing against your chest? That's not just their story. That's the silence you live in too. The story of the Galvins is over, but the silence is everywhere. The Galvins were not just a family. They were a resource. By the time scientists realized what was happening inside that Colorado Springs household, the brothers were already breaking apart. Their lives were unraveling in psych wards, suicide attempts, violent episodes. And yet for the medical establishment it wasn't tragedy, it was opportunity. 6 sons with schizophrenia inside one family. That was unheard of. To psychiatrists, it was like stumbling upon a gold vein in the middle of the desert. Most studies required years of recruitment, dozens of scattered families, scattered variables. But the Galvins contained it all in one bloodline. A concentration of genetic inheritance so pure it felt almost designed. The National Institute of Mental Health came knocking. Researchers from Columbia, from the University of Colorado, from labs across the country all wanted a piece of the Galvins' DNA. Vials of blood were drawn, stored, and catalogued. Neurons were studied, proteins analyzed, gene sequences combed. For decades, their DNA sat in freezers and databases, labeled and archived like artifacts. In 2016, the breakthrough came. A discovery that a variation in the C4 gene, the one tied to synaptic pruning in adolescence, was strongly linked to schizophrenia. And among the genetic samples that helped prove it, the Galvins. The scientific world hailed it as a milestone. Finally, a concrete piece of the puzzle, a real clue into why teenage brains sometimes collapse into psychosis. News outlets published articles, researchers won prestige, universities touted the discovery, and yet, what did the Galvins themselves get? They were still a shattered family. They were still carrying scars, still haunted by memories of violence, still trying to stitch together lives that had been consumed. Their father was dead. Their mother was widowed, embittered, and defensive. Half their siblings were lost to illness or suicide. The sisters were still struggling to find language for the abuse they had suffered. To the world, the Galvins were data points. To themselves, they were wreckage. That is the cruelty at the heart of science. It feeds on pain but rarely heals it. It extracts knowledge from suffering but does not erase the suffering itself. For every genetic marker discovered, for every paper published, for every TED Talk where some bright-eyed scientist declares we're closer than ever to understanding schizophrenia, there are families like the Galvins still trying to survive in the shadows. And the system keeps them there because there's another layer to this story, one darker than genes and medicine. The Galvins were also used by culture. When Kolker's book Hidden Valley Road came out, readers devoured it like a true crime thriller. Headlines screamed about the family with 6 schizophrenic brothers. The marketing leaned into the horror, the sensational. Oprah picked it for her book club. Hollywood circled with adaptation deals. It was entertainment. Their suffering, 12 children torn apart by illness and abuse, became fodder for page-turners, podcasts, think pieces, film scripts. Their names were repeated in living rooms, in classrooms, in coffee shops, almost like characters in a Gothic novel. Do you see the pattern? First science consumed them, then media consumed them. Each time the Galvins became less like people and more like symbols. But symbols are dangerous, because they erase nuance. When people hear 6 brothers with schizophrenia, they imagine monsters. They imagine madness as spectacle. They don't think about the tenderness, the brief moments of clarity, the attempts at normalcy, the flickers of humanity inside the illness. They don't think about the sister's quiet endurance. They don't think about a mother folding laundry in silence while her sons raged. Symbols flatten. They strip away the mess and leave only the headline. And yet, here we are, telling their story again, adding to the cycle, repeating their names, holding them up as evidence of something larger. So what's the difference between exploitation and truth-telling? Maybe it lies in how the silence is handled, because the real violence done to the Galvins wasn't just schizophrenia, it wasn't just abuse. It was the silence that wrapped around them like barbed wire, preventing escape. When media tells their story as horror, it replicates that. Silence. It uses their pain without honoring their voices. But when their story is told with their voices, with their complexity, with the rawness of what they endured, then silence is broken. That's the razor's edge. That's the tension of this narrative. Because when you peel back all the layers, the science, the spectacle, the tragedy, you see something even more unsettling. The Galvins are not an anomaly. They are a mirror. Think about your own life, your own family. Maybe not schizophrenia, maybe not abuse on this scale, but silence, secrets, the things not spoken, the things hidden to keep the image intact. That is where the rot begins. The Galvins were extraordinary only in scale, but the machinery that devoured them, silence, control, appearances, exploitation, is ordinary. It is everywhere. It is in your neighborhood, in your school, in your church, in your government. The Galvins' tragedy is not just a cautionary tale. It is a map. It shows you how silence metastasizes, how systems feed on the vulnerable, how progress is built on bones. So when you hear scientists speak about breakthroughs in mental health, when you see headlines about miraculous discoveries, remember the cost. Remember the family in Colorado Springs whose blood made the research possible. Remember the sisters who were told to keep quiet. Remember the father who wore the mask of discipline until it strangled his children. Remember the mother who scrubbed floors while the house collapsed around her. And ask yourself, how many families are being consumed right now in silence for the sake of progress and spectacle? Because the story of the Galvins isn't over. It was never just about them. It's about the silence you're living in now. Silence is not absence. It is not emptiness. It is not nothing. Silence is an architecture. It is designed, built, enforced. And in the Galvin household, it was the mortar that held the walls together while everything inside was rotting. But here's the part we're never told. The silence didn't start in that house. It started long before. It began with the war, with a father returning broken but unpermitted to admit it, with a mother taught that obedience was virtue and confession was sin, with institutions, military, church, psychiatric, that thrive on order and therefore on silence. Donald Galvin, the patriarch, was a man who returned from World War II carrying ghosts in his chest. He had seen death, chaos, dismemberment, but in 1940s America, there was no vocabulary for trauma. PTSD was not a recognized illness. Men were expected to return home, shake hands, mow lawns, raise families, and never speak of the nightmares clawing through their sleep. So silence took root. Then came Mimi, the mother, a devout Catholic, a woman who believed in hierarchy, in tradition, in the sacred duty of keeping the family's image intact. To her, confession was something you gave to a priest, never to the public, never to a neighbor, never to your children. Sin could be scrubbed away, silence could preserve holiness, and when these two people came together, silence became doctrine. Inside the house on Hidden Valley Road, appearances were sacred. Children were dressed, photographed, paraded like trophies. Behind closed doors, chaos reigned, psychosis, hallucinations, rage. But to the outside world, perfection. A military family, a Catholic family, a model American family. This is how silence works. It polishes the outside of the coffin so no one asks what's inside. But silence doesn't stay contained. It spreads. It metastasizes. The children learned it early. When the older brothers began unraveling, voices whispering, paranoia flaring, violence erupting, the younger ones learned to say nothing, to bury bruises, to excuse broken glass, to walk past blood as if it were spilled milk. And the sisters bore the heaviest weight. Molested by their brothers, ignored by their parents, forced to live with trauma they couldn't speak, they learned the most brutal lesson of all. Silence is survival. You see, silence is not just absence of speech. It is a weapon, a discipline, a survival mechanism passed down until it becomes culture. And it doesn't just live in families, it lives in every system we inhabit. Think of the church scandals, priests abusing children for decades, covered up by bishops, silenced by parishes, whispered about but never confronted. Think of the military, suicides, assaults, the crushing of whistleblowers, all hidden under medals and flags. Think of corporations, toxic spills, unsafe factories, harassment lawsuits buried under NDAs. Think of governments, atrocities sealed in classified files, secrets redacted in black ink, entire populations taught not to question. Silence is not an accident, it is policy. And like in the Galvin home, silence doesn't just hide pain, it creates it. Because when truth is forbidden, rot multiplies. Imagine growing up in that house, 6 brothers losing their minds in different directions, one believing the CIA was hunting him, another convinced demons whispered through the radio, another pacing the halls with a knife, muttering about conspiracies, each breakdown feeding the need, or each delusion creating new fractures. And in the center of it all, a mother folding laundry, insisting nothing was wrong, a father tightening his jaw, saying the family must endure, neighbors shaking their heads politely but never asking questions, teachers avoiding confrontation, doctors treating symptoms but not context. Silence turned the house into a laboratory of suffering, and here is the chilling truth. Silence works the same way outside that house. You think your neighborhood is safe because the lawns are trimmed and the cars are washed? Walk past those doors at night. Listen carefully. How many screams are muffled? How many bottles are emptied in secret? How many children learn to tiptoe around rage? How many women whisper, "I'm fine," through a broken smile? Silence is the most American institution. It protects the image of perfection while devouring the people inside it. The Galvins were not unique. They were simply extreme. They show us the mechanism turned up to maximum volume. What happens when silence is weaponized so completely that 12 children become collateral damage in the war between truth and appearance? But the parasite of silence lives everywhere. It lives in you. Think of the secrets you don't say, the things your family doesn't discuss, the history you were told to ignore, the pain you swallow because it's easier than breaking the image. That is silence doing its work. And here's the most terrifying part. Silence doesn't just hide suffering. It breeds it. It makes it stronger. Every unspoken word is a seed. Seeds grow roots. Roots crack foundations. Entire houses, entire communities, entire nations collapse because silence has been allowed to grow unchecked. In the Galvin home, silence bred schizophrenia into violence. It bred abuse into generational trauma. It bred secrecy into despair. But step back, and you'll see the same pattern on a larger scale. Nations go mad just like families. Societies hallucinate just like individuals. Whole cultures collapse into violence when silence keeps the truth buried long enough. And so the Galvin story is not just about one tragic family. It is about a system that feeds on silence until it explodes. The question is not, how could this happen to them? The question is, how is this happening to you? Because if silence was the parasite that devoured the Galvins, silence is the parasite already devouring us all. And like every parasite, it will not stop until it has eaten everything. Silence does not remain still forever. It ferments, it swells, it ruptures. And when it finally bursts, it doesn't look like silence anymore. It looks like violence. Inside the Galvin home, the cracks became impossible to hide. 6 brothers, each unraveling in their own way, began to turn their inner storms outward. What had been whispers became shouts. What had been paranoia became blood. One brother would retreat to his room for days, emerging unwashed, eyes darting, convinced he was being monitored through the walls. Another became obsessed with knives, pacing the hallways at night, muttering about invisible enemies. Another lashed out without warning, beating younger siblings until they bled, then collapsing into tears he couldn't explain. The sisters, mothers now, grandmothers even, would later confess that some of the worst wounds were never spoken of until decades had passed. One sister remembered being pulled into her brother's room, the lock clicking shut, her screams ignored by the household that had been trained to ignore everything. Another described bruises covered with long sleeves, a smile fixed to her face because silence was safer than truth. And yet, even then, even with scars obvious and neighbors suspicious, the facade held. Mimi, the mother, polished her mask with religious fervor. When asked, she said her boys were moody, or difficult, or simply going through a phase. She clung to her belief that order, dinners on time, shirts tucked in, mass on Sunday, could hold back the chaos. But order is not strength. Order is a shell. And when the pressure inside grew too great, the shell cracked. The violence escalated, pets were killed, windows shattered, hands were wrapped around throats. The house on Hidden Valley Road stopped being a home. It became a war zone. Children tiptoed through hallways like soldiers navigating minefields, never knowing when the next explosion would come. The father, Donald, responded the only way he knew how, with discipline. He believed in obedience, in control, in military toughness. His solution was not tenderness or treatment. It was silence, reinforced with authority. Endure, he would say. Get through it. Be strong. But strength is not the same as survival, and endurance is not the same as healing. The violence inside the house was mirrored by the violence of the institutions surrounding it. Doctors, when finally consulted, prescribed drugs but never context. Police, when called, treated it as family business. Priests offered prayer but discouraged exposure. Every system offered the same answer: silence. Do you see it now? Silence and violence are not opposites. They are partners. Silence suppresses the truth until it becomes unbearable. Violence is the eruption that follows. And when violence comes, silence steps back in to clean the mess, to cover it up, to ensure the cycle continues. This cycle destroyed the Galvin family. 6 brothers lost their minds to schizophrenia, each collapse punctuated with episodes of brutality. The surviving siblings carried the marks for life: trauma, mistrust, fractured identities. Even decades later, when researchers came to study their DNA, the family's story was told in the language of science, not pain. The violence became data points, the abuse became case studies, the screams became statistics. And that is the most chilling part. Violence is not just an accident of silence. It is the outcome that institutions anticipate, even depend on. Because when violence erupts, the system gains power. Police gain jurisdiction. Hospitals gain patients, researchers gain subjects, judges gain cases. Silence breeds violence, and violence feeds the machine. Now, step back. Look beyond the Galvin house. Do you recognize the same pattern in the world around you? Domestic violence hidden by neighbors until a body shows up. Workplace harassment smothered in NDAs until lawsuits explode. Governments suppressing dissent until riots fill the streets. Churches covering scandals until headlines force their hands. The silence never prevented the violence. It incubated it. This is the truth the Galvin family reveals. Silence is not passive. It is active violence delayed. It is a time bomb, and when it goes off, the blast radius consumes not just individuals but generations. Think of the sisters again. They carried their trauma silently into adulthood. They married, had children, raised families of their own. But silence doesn't disappear. It mutates. It becomes mistrust, fear, shame. It seeps into the next generation, teaching children to avoid hard truths, to bury their pain, to perpetuate the very system that destroyed their parents. The Galvin's collapse is not just a tragedy. It is a map, a warning, a mirror held to all of us. How many secrets sit in your family, waiting to erupt? How many institutions are holding back storms with silence, pretending that order will hold? How many lives are being cracked open right now, violence breeding in the dark, waiting for its turn to explode? Violence is not random. It is the inevitable child of silence. And so, when you hear the story of the Galvins, you are not just hearing about one family on one road in Colorado. You are hearing about yourself. You are hearing about the cost of silence in your own bloodline, in your own community, in your own world. Because the parasite of silence does not care about names. It does not care about time. It only cares about survival. And the way it survives is by breeding violence. The Galvins tried to keep their silence contained. They failed. The house became a crime scene of madness. The violence consumed them. And when it was over, all that remained was data for scientists, shame for survivors, and silence once again. That is how the parasite feeds. That is how it grows. And if you think you are safe from it, remember this: silence is already in you. The question is only, how long before it erupts? When the house finally cracked open, when the police reports, the hospitalizations, the whispers could no longer be ignored, another figure entered the Galvin story. Not a priest, not a neighbor, not a rescuer, a scientist. At first glance, it looked like salvation. Researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health had heard rumors of a family in Colorado with not one, not two, but 6 brothers diagnosed with schizophrenia. For psychiatrists and geneticists, this was not a tragedy. It was a miracle, a goldmine, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to study schizophrenia in its purest form. So they came, notebooks in hand, blood kits prepared, questions rehearsed. They introduced themselves politely. They promised answers, treatments, breakthroughs. They told the family their suffering could save others, that their pain could be transformed into progress. But the truth was harsher. The Galvins weren't seen as people anymore. They were specimens, a living laboratory. The researchers drew blood, collected DNA, mapped genealogies. They interviewed siblings about abuse, hallucinations, delusions, but always through the lens of science, not empathy. The sisters described trauma, but the notes reduced it to possible environmental factors. The brothers' violent outbursts became episodes. The scars became data points. Think about that. Imagine your worst memory, your darkest secret, being stripped of humanity and catalogued as a statistic. Imagine your screams becoming a line in a graph. That's what happened. Ed on Hidden Valley Road. The Galvin family was dissected not with scalpels but with questions, forms, tests. The researchers were not cruel, not openly malicious, but they were detached. They didn't see 12 siblings, 2 parents, a shattered household. They saw a puzzle, a riddle written in blood, a chance to prove their theories. And the theories were tantalizing. For decades, psychiatry had been trapped in uncertainty. Was schizophrenia caused by trauma, by bad parenting, by chemical imbalance, by genes? The Galvins seemed to hold the answer. 6 cases in one family, too concentrated to be coincidence. Their DNA, their chromosomes, their shared ancestry. This was the smoking gun. So the scientists probed. They searched the genome for glitches, mutations, repeating codes. They believed that inside the Galvin suffering was a map to the origins of madness itself. And in time they found something. A gene. SHANK2, SHANK3, fragments tied to synaptic scaffolding in the brain. The connections that should hold thought together were frayed, unstable. The Galvins had carried it like a curse, passing it from parent to child, unseen until it bloomed into psychosis. Science celebrated, papers were written, grants were won. The Galvins were hailed as the family that helped unlock schizophrenia. Their tragedy became a stepping stone for progress. But here is the shadow no one talks about. The Galvins themselves didn't get better. The brothers still lived and died inside their madness. The sisters still carried the trauma. The father died with his reputation intact, untouched by the wreckage he had helped enforce. Mimi, the mother, clung to religion until the end, her belief in order never shaken. The research didn't heal them, it harvested them. This is where the parasite of silence mutates again. First it suppresses truth, then it breeds violence, and finally it invites exploitation. Institutions step in, not to rescue, but to consume. Think carefully about that pattern, because it's not unique to the Galvins. It happens everywhere. After a school shooting, politicians pose for cameras, but families are left to grieve. After a natural disaster, data is gathered, but survivors still starve in shelters. After abuse scandals, reports are filed, but the victims are left fractured. Tragedy is never wasted by institutions. It is harvested, converted, monetized. And for the Galvins, their harvest was genetic. Their blood became the property of science. Their suffering became the foundation of psychiatric journals, pharmaceutical funding, and research labs across the globe. The system did not ask their permission. It did not ask what they needed. It only asked, "What can we take from you?" This is the cost of being extraordinary in tragedy. You are no longer human, you are a specimen. The Galvin story forces us to ask, is progress worth it? Do breakthroughs built on blood justify the silence, the violence, the exploitation? If schizophrenia treatments improve, if future generations suffer less, does that balance the scales of one family's suffering? Science will say yes. The system will always say yes. But the survivors tell a different story. One sister later admitted she wished the scientists had never come. She said it felt like being stripped naked again, her family exposed to strangers, their shame broadcast in labs and journals. Another said she felt used, as if the tragedy of her life had been stolen from her and turned into something she could never control. That is the real price of progress, ownership of pain. Once institutions touch it, it no longer belongs to you. And this is where the parasite of silence, it reveals its final trick. Even when voices are finally heard, they are not heard as they truly are. They are translated, diluted, rewritten. The Galvins spoke, but their words were consumed by the language of science. The truth was reduced to a statistic, and in that reduction, the parasite won again. Because silence is not only the absence of words. Silence is what happens when your words are taken from you, reshaped until they serve someone else's purpose. The Galvins gave their truth. The system turned it into research, and the cycle continued. So I ask you, how much of your own truth has been harvested? How much of your pain has been converted into someone else's profit? How many of your words have been rewritten until they no longer belong to you? The Galvins were not the end. They were the beginning. A case study, yes, but also a mirror, a warning, a prophecy, because if it happened to them, it can happen to you. And maybe it already has. The scientists weren't the only ones who fed on the Galvin story. When their DNA was processed, when the research was published, when the psychiatric journals whispered about the family with 6 schizophrenic sons, it was only a matter of time before another machine arrived, the machine of media. First came the journalists, curious, hungry, smelling blood in the water. They had heard about the family of 12, the perfect Catholic facade, the descent into madness. They wanted details, names, photographs, quotes that could turn clinical data into human tragedy. Then came the publishers. Book contracts, proposals. The greatest psychiatric story never told. Editors pitched it as both horror and hope. A tale of devastation, but also science, discovery, resilience. Finally came the cameras. Documentarians circling like vultures, rehearsing their shots. The crumbling house, the faded family portraits, the falconry glove still hanging in the garage. They wanted atmosphere, mystery, drama. They wanted to package the Galvins, and Mimi, the matriarch, said yes. For decades she had maintained silence, the iron Catholic rule that nothing escapes the walls of the home. But when her children's lives had already been dissected by hospitals and scientists, she chose a different weapon, narrative. If they were going to be exposed, she thought, then she would decide how. She cooperated with interviews. She opened old boxes of photographs. She let her surviving children speak. She presented the Galvins as both cursed and chosen, ordinary people caught in extraordinary suffering. The book Hidden Valley Road was born. It became a bestseller. It was praised as haunting, compassionate, revelatory. Reviewers called it a masterpiece of narrative non-fiction, a landmark in mental health awareness. For many, it was the first time they had heard about the Galvins at all. But here is the darker truth. Even in this retelling, the family was consumed again, because every page, every headline, every award carried the same transaction. Their suffering for your consumption. Their madness became your fascination. Their secrets became your entertainment. The sisters who had endured abuse, who had begged to be believed, were forced to relive it for readers who do. Evoured it like a thriller. The brothers' psychosis was described in detail, their delusions quoted, their violence reconstructed. The very things that had destroyed the family became the selling points. And the cycle repeated. Science had harvested their blood. Media harvested their story. It's easy to argue that this exposure helped. After all, Hidden Valley Road brought schizophrenia into mainstream conversation. It broke stigma. It educated readers. It humanized a condition that too often is hidden in shadows. But at what cost? Because the Galvins did not walk away whole. They walked away raw, their private horrors dissected for strangers to consume. Their lives became a parable. Their pain became a brand. And this raises a brutal question. Is awareness just another form of exploitation? We live in a culture that feeds on trauma. True crime podcasts, Netflix docuseries, viral TikToks of survivors telling their stories. We gorge ourselves on the suffering of others, convincing ourselves that listening is helping, that knowing is healing. But is it? Or are we just consuming misery the way previous generations consumed bloodsport, at a safe distance, comfortably horrified? The Galvins became a spectacle, a case study, a bestseller. Their name turned into a shorthand for tragedy. Oh, you know, the family with 12 kids and 6 schizophrenic sons. Their humanity dissolved into a tagline. That is the final mutation of the parasite of silence. When silence finally breaks, it does not always set you free. Sometimes it just changes shape. Sometimes it becomes noise, loud, profitable, sensational. Your voice echoes, but it no longer belongs to you. And think about this. Every reader of Hidden Valley Road closed the book, set it aside, and returned to their life. Moved, shaken, educated perhaps, but free. The Galvins, however, could never close the book. They were trapped inside it, their lives still unraveling, their scars still bleeding, while the world consumed them and moved on. This is the curse of being turned into a story. The audience gets closure. You never do. Mimi, before she died, believed she had redeemed her family by telling their truth. She clung to the idea that the book was a victory, that at last the world would understand. But some of her children disagreed. Some felt stripped bare, violated again. They had survived decades of silence, only to find that breaking it was another kind of prison. And here is the cruelest irony. The very system that had abandoned them, medicine, psychiatry, media, profited twice. First from their silence, then from their speech. The Galvins became immortal not through healing, not through recovery, but through exposure. And that is not a victory, that is a warning, because the same machine waits for you. When tragedy strikes, when silence breaks, the vultures will come. They will take your blood, your story, your name. They will tell you it is for progress, for awareness, for education. They will say your pain has meaning. But ask yourself, meaning for whom? The Galvins remind us that in this world, even truth can be weaponized, even healing can be commodified, and even breaking silence can be another form of control. So when you hear their story, when you feel that chill in your chest, when you wonder how such devastation could happen in one family, remember this. The tragedy is not just what happened inside their home. The tragedy is what happened after, how the world consumed them again and again, until their suffering became nothing more than content. And the question, and that lingers heavy and poisonous, is this. When it's your turn, will you be heard, or will you be harvested? You may be tempted to believe the Galvins were unique, a once-in-a-lifetime genetic accident, a tragic family that happened to carry too much darkness in their blood. But that's the illusion, because the deeper you look, the more you realize the Galvins are not an exception. They are a mirror, a pattern, a truth that society works tirelessly to hide. Think of it this way. Every institution in the Galvins' lives functioned exactly as designed. The military trained the father to suppress, endure, obey. The church trained the mother to sacrifice, conceal, conform. The schools trained the children to stay silent even as they unraveled. The medical system trained itself to extract data, not deliver compassion. The media trained the world to consume their pain as entertainment. Nothing about this was accidental. Every layer of silence, every moment of erasure, every transaction of suffering was systemic. This is how control works. It doesn't need chains or whips. It doesn't need guards at your door. All it needs is silence. And silence is easy to produce when families are told to protect their reputations, when soldiers are told to endure, when women are told to obey, when children are told to fear. The Galvins simply carried the silence further than most families could survive. But if you peel back the surface of any neighborhood, any parish, any school, you'll find echoes. The family where abuse festers behind tidy curtains, the veteran who returns broken and drinks himself hollow in a garage, the mother who hides bruises beneath long sleeves, the child who draws monsters on notebook paper while teachers grade spelling tests and look away. The Galvins weren't special, they were simply exposed, and exposure is what terrifies society most. They are multiplied, their house is everywhere, their silence is still in your bloodstream. And the question that circles, sharp and inevitable, is this: how long will you pretend not to hear it? If silence can destroy a family, what can it do to a nation? The Galvin's house may seem like a private tragedy, but their story is a microcosm of something far larger. Families are where silence is trained. Institutions are where silence is enforced, and governments are where silence is engineered. Consider how power survives, not by truth, not by transparency, but by selective silence, by deciding which voices are amplified, which are erased, and which are buried altogether. The Galvins were not studied by scientists because they were special. They were studied because their suffering was useful, and usefulness is the highest currency in systems of power. Governments and corporations have always known this. Think of the Tuskegee experiment, where silence allowed black men to die slow, preventable deaths so doctors could watch the disease unfold. Think of Cold War experiments, where soldiers and prisoners were dosed with LSD without consent, their shattered minds dismissed as collateral damage in the name of progress. Think of the native children buried in boarding schools, their voices silenced, their histories rewritten, their graves unmarked for decades. The pattern is the same. Take a vulnerable population, enforce silence, extract data, discard the wreckage. The Galvins fit perfectly into that system. Their silence kept the family intact long enough for researchers to arrive. Their obedience ensured that their DNA, their trauma, their suffering could be packaged as groundbreaking research. Their eventual exposure came not as liberation but as commodification, another best-selling book, another media cycle, another round of consumption. Silence, again, served its purpose, but here is the most unsettling realization. Silence is not just tolerated by governments, it is designed. Censorship, disinformation, propaganda, classified archives. These are not accidents, they are tools to weaponize silence. The state decides what you know, when you know it, and how you are allowed to respond. The louder the violence, the deeper the silence that follows. 9/11, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. Each eruption of violence followed by calculated silence, redacted reports, restricted photos, official narratives, endless delays. Victims erased. Truth delayed until outrage cools. This is silence as strategy, silence as control, silence as survival for the powerful. And here's the truth most people cannot bear to face. Silence is more effective than violence for keeping people obedient. Violence can provoke rebellion, but silence convinces you there is nothing to rebel against. That is why so many families like the Galvins implode without intervention. That is why so many communities collapse under secrets. That is why so many governments endure, even after committing atrocities. Because silence doesn't just hide the wound, it convinces you the wound was never there. Think again of the Galvin sisters. They grew up knowing something was horribly wrong. They endured abuse, chaos, violence, and yet, for decades, they doubted themselves. Why? Because silence taught them to mistrust their own memory, to question their own truth. Governments use the same tactic. Citizens are shown one version of history in schools, another in media, another in whispers that surface decades later. Because exposure shatters the illusion that we are safe, that madness is distant, that trauma only happens elsewhere. Exposure forces us to admit that what happened in one house on Hidden Valley Road is happening in countless others, right now, right next door. The system survives on your belief that tragedy is rare, that it belongs to unlucky families, broken bloodlines, cursed genetics, because if you believe that, you'll never notice the patterns. You'll never ask who benefits from silence. You'll never question why institutions fail again and again while appearing spotless in the light. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Silence is the operating system of power. Families are its laboratories, and stories like the Galvins are not outliers, they are prototypes. Think about it. 6 brothers descend into schizophrenia, yet the family remains respected in the community. Children cry for help, but priests and doctors call it exaggeration. Mothers cover bruises with makeup, while neighbors comment on their strength. Institutions study the wreckage, publish papers, profit, and then move on. Sound familiar? It should. Because whether it's the Galvins, or the victims of clergy abuse, or the survivors of military experiments, or the children buried in schools for the unwanted, the pattern is identical. Silence, exploitation, erasure, consumption. And here's the most unsettling part. Silence doesn't just protect the abuser or the system, it reshapes the victim too. After enough years, silence becomes self-policing. Victims censor themselves, families rewrite their own history. Survivors convince themselves it was not so bad. They build narratives to make sense of the senseless, and by the time the truth surfaces, decades later, it is blurred, fractured, doubted. That's why when the Galvins finally spoke, their words carried both clarity and confusion. Some siblings remembered vividly, others contradicted. Trauma had scrambled the timelines, fogged the details. Silence had done its work, eroding even memory, and yet the story still resonated. Not because it was perfect, but because it was familiar. We recognized ourselves in it. That's why the book became a bestseller. That's why media swarmed. Not because the Galvins were unique, but because they were archetypal. A perfect American family, harboring rot. A genetic tragedy, magnified by institutional neglect. A secret house of horrors, hiding in plain sight. This is not an isolated nightmare. This is the American dream with its mask torn away. You may think you are safe because your family does not resemble theirs, but safety is another illusion. The silence that destroyed them exists in every household, every community. It thrives wherever truth is buried under reputation, obedience, or fear. So the real horror of the Galvin story is not their DNA. It is not schizophrenia. It is not even abuse. The real horror is how ordinary their silence was. And that is why their story refuses to die. Because deep down, you know this is not history. It is present tense. Right now, another family is collapsing in silence. Right now, another child is screaming into a void. Right now, another institution is harvesting tragedy while pretending to heal. The Galvins are not gone. By the time the truth emerges, it feels unreal, distant, distorted, deniable. That's why exposure is always delayed, why files are classified for 50 years, why survivors are discredited, why whistleblowers are silenced or punished. Silence doesn't erase reality, it erodes it, slowly, invisibly, until even the victims doubt it ever happened. The Galvin story, once released, was framed as science, as tragedy, as curiosity. But what if it was also something else? What if it was evidence, not of a single family's collapse, but of a system that requires collapse to function? Ask yourself, why do we always find out about tragedies after they've already consumed lives? Why do governments always apologize decades too late? Why do institutions always pledge reform only when silence can no longer hold? Because the silence was not a failure. It was the plan. And if that unsettles you, it should. Because it means the parasite of silence does not just live in families, it lives in systems. It is embedded in laws, in policies, in economies. It thrives wherever secrecy is rewarded, wherever transparency is punished. Look around. A government delays releasing files on assassinations for national security. A corporation buries studies about toxins until lawsuits pile high. A police department hides body cam footage until riots erupt. A church shuffles abusers quietly while preaching forgiveness. These are not mistakes. These are not oversights. These are the architecture of silence. The Galvins were a test case, a glimpse behind the curtain. Their collapse revealed the private cost of silence. But at scale, silence does not just destroy families. It destroys histories. It erases cultures. It reshapes entire nations. And the most horrifying part, silence works. It kept the Galvin family bound together for decades, even as they tore each other apart. It kept institutions untouchable. Heil children were broken inside their walls. It keeps governments stable while blood runs beneath their foundations. You may think truth is stronger, but truth without power is fragile. Truth without amplification is silence in disguise. So the question is not whether silence will end. It is whether we will ever have the courage to break it before it mutates into violence. Because make no mistake, violence will come. It always comes. It came for the Galvins. It came for communities erased by colonization. It came for prisoners treated as experiments. It came for nations that ignored festering wounds until they split open in revolution. Silence always breeds violence. And when violence erupts, the cycle begins again. The parasite survives. And unless we recognize it, so will the silence. You've heard the phrase, civilization is built on stories. But what if that's only half true? What if civilization is built not on stories, but on silences? Every empire that has ever risen did so on a foundation of what could not be spoken. Rome was not just gladiators and marble. It was the silence of slaves, the silence of conquered tribes, the silence of women who had no voice in law. Colonial America was not just revolution and liberty. It was the silence of indigenous graves, the silence of ships heavy with chained bodies. The modern world is not just skyscrapers and technology. It is the silence of factory workers bent over assembly lines, the silence of forests razed, the silence of entire species erased before anyone learns their names. We celebrate the stories, but it is the silences that hold everything together. Think of silence as the scaffolding of history. It is invisible, but it supports the weight of every monument, every institution, every triumph. Without silence, the contradictions would collapse the structure. Without silence, we would hear the screams beneath the anthem, the ghosts beneath the marble, the graves beneath the highways. Without silence, civilization itself might be unbearable. This is why silence is not just a byproduct, it is the blueprint. Look again at the Galvins. Their house on Hidden Valley Road was presented as an American dream. A large family, a stable military father, a devoted mother, children dressed neatly in photographs. The silence was what allowed the illusion to function. Without silence, the neighbors would have seen abuse. Without silence, the church would have had to act. Without silence, the institutions would have been forced to intervene. The Galvin silence wasn't weakness, it was the very mechanism that allowed them to appear normal. Their silence built the facade, now expand that outward. Nations do the same. Governments require silence to maintain myths, silence about genocide, silence about corruption, silence about blood spilled for resources, borders, or power. Without that silence, the myth of order would shatter. And here lies the most terrifying truth. Perhaps we don't just tolerate silence, we need it. Because what happens if every silence broke at once? What if every family exposed its abuse, every institution confessed its crimes, every government revealed its archives, every society admitted its lies? Could we withstand that avalanche of truth? Or would civilization dissolve under the unbearable weight of its own honesty? We like to believe that truth sets us free, but what if truth destroys us? What if the silence is the only thing holding back collapse? This is where the Galvins become more than a tragedy. They become a prophecy. Their family was a miniature civilization built on silence. For decades the silence held. They functioned barely inside the illusion of normalcy. But when the silence finally cracked, everything came spilling out. Madness, abuse, betrayal, shame. The facade collapsed. The family never recovered. What if nations face the same fate? What if civilization itself is just one long, fragile silence, waiting for the inevitable break? History suggests it always happens. Empires rise, silence sustains them. Truth eventually bleeds through, collapse follows. Rome fell, colonial powers crumbled, dictatorships rot from within. The silence never lasts forever, and yet new silences are always constructed. New myths are written, new histories are sanitized. The cycle continues, because silence is not just repression. Silence is architecture. It arranges what we see and what we cannot. It edits memory. It filters noise. It protects us from unbearable truths until we are numb enough to accept them. It ensures survival, even at the cost of truth. This is why silence feels parasitic, but also symbiotic. We curse it, we fear it, but we also cling to it. Families cling to silence because exposure would destroy them. Governments cling to silence because exposure would destabilize them. People cling to silence because to speak the truth would make them outsiders, traitors, heretics. The parasite feeds us while it feeds on us. So the Galvins are not just a family destroyed by silence. They are a reflection of us all. They show us what happens when silence is stretched past its breaking point, when the blueprint cracks, when the architecture caves in. And perhaps the most disturbing possibility is this: silence is not failing. Silence is working exactly as intended. It protects civilization by sacrificing individuals. It maintains the facade by consuming the vulnerable. It sustains the whole by destroying the parts. The Galvins were sacrificed to maintain the larger illusion, just as countless others have been. And so, when you look at their story, do not see it as a tragedy of genetics or of one unlucky family. See it as a revelation of how the world truly works. Because the same silence that erased their screams is the silence that keeps the streets quiet in your neighborhood. The same silence that buried their truth is the silence that allows you to believe your society is stable. The same silence that killed them, slowly, invisibly, is the silence that keeps you alive in ignorance. But ignorance has a cost, because when silence finally breaks, and it always does, the collapse is catastrophic. Families fall, institutions crumble, nations riot, empires dissolve, the parasite becomes visible, and when it does, the only question left is, so, who will survive the silence breaking? Imagine it. The silences holding everything together start to crack, not one by one, but all at once. The dam bursts. The parasite dies, but in dying, it releases everything it held back. A family's silence shatters, and decades of abuse spill into the open. A church's silence collapses, and thousands of testimonies erupt like a flood. A government's silence breaks, and classified archives hit the light of day, exposing crimes so vast that entire histories are rewritten overnight. And then it spreads. The lies holding corporations together fracture, hidden poisons in our food, toxins in our water, surveillance buried inside the very devices we cradle in our hands. The secrets of nations unravel, wars justified by fabrications, disasters covered up, atrocities whitewashed. The silences of ordinary people collapse, hidden infidelities, hidden debts, hidden resentments erupting into violence at kitchen tables and city streets alike. For centuries, silence has been the glue. When that glue melts, civilization doesn't bend, it splinters. Because silence isn't just absence, it is a pressure chamber. Every secret is airless, every unspoken truth is weight, and when the walls finally collapse, all that compressed pressure detonates. Picture it. In homes, fathers confronted by daughters who refuse to carry their secrets anymore, mothers confessing betrayals they swore would go to the grave, families imploding as the unspoken becomes unbearable speech. In institutions, archives unlocked, revealing that the foundations of medicine, law, and religion are soaked in the blood of those who were silenced. Statues toppled, histories rewritten not by scholars, but by survivors who finally have the microphone. In nations, governments stripped naked as files pour into the public. Every assassination explained, every coup traced, every deal revealed. The myth of order collapsing under the weight of its own documented treachery. This is what apocalypse really means. Not fire in the sky, but revelation. Not an asteroid, but silence collapsing. Not the end of the world, but the end of the illusion that held the world together. And here's the cruel paradox. We think we want truth. We chant for transparency. We demand accountability, but do we truly understand what it would mean if every silence ended? If every victim spoke, every secret was unearthed, every crime revealed? Could the human mind withstand that flood? Or would it collapse, just like the Galvins, crushed under the weight of too much reality at once? Maybe that's why silence exists. Maybe it's not only a parasite, but also a firewall, a shield that prevents society from tearing itself apart under truths too heavy to carry. But like any firewall, it cannot hold forever. Pressure always finds a fracture. Look at history. Every revolution is the sound of silence shattering. France in 1789, Russia in 1917, civil rights in the 1960s. Silence builds, until the truth explodes and streets fill with fire. The Galvins were a small-scale apocalypse. Their silence burst, and everything came crashing down. Trust, sanity, identity, love. Now scale that to nations, to the globe. Do you see it? The apocalypse is not coming in some distant cinematic future. The apocalypse is already leaking through the cracks. The archives being declassified, the whistleblowers breaking rank, the survivors telling stories their families begged them never to tell. The silences are breaking one by one, and the tremors are growing. And when they converge, when all silences collapse at once, it won't look like fire raining from the sky. It will look like voices, too many voices, every voice speaking at once, every silence broken. The noise will be unbearable. Imagine trying to scroll through your feed, but every suppressed truth floods it at once. Imagine trying to hold a conversation, but every person you love suddenly unloads everything they never said. Imagine trying to walk through your city, but every wall is covered in truths painted like graffiti, truths the government swore you were not ready for. That is the apocalypse, not silence, but the death of silence. And yet, Perhaps that is also salvation, because silence has been the parasite all along. It protected civilization, yes, but only by feeding on the vulnerable. It kept the facade intact, but only by consuming those least able to bear it. The Galvins bore it until they shattered. How many more families, how many more nations are quietly breaking under the same weight right now? The apocalypse, then, may not be something to fear, but something to endure. Because silence breaking is not just collapse, it is possibility. It is the chance to rebuild on truth rather than illusion, to construct a civilization not on hidden graves but on voices heard. But survival will not be easy, because when silence dies, everything it held back will come rushing out like floodwater, and floods do not discriminate. They destroy as much as they cleanse. So, maybe the question is not whether silence should end, maybe the question is whether we are strong enough to live without it. If the Galvins teach us anything, it is this: silence will always end. The parasite cannot feed forever. The only choice is whether we confront it on our own terms, or wait for the flood to sweep us away. Because once the apocalypse of silence begins, there is no turning back. The voices will not stop. The truths will not rest. The flood will not recede. And when that day comes, when the silence finally dies, you will have to decide. Will you cling to the ruins of the old illusion? Or will you step into the noise and help build a world without silence? The flood has passed. The silences have ruptured. The truths have poured out. The illusions have collapsed. Families have imploded. Nations have fractured. Institutions that once seemed eternal have crumbled into rubble. The parasite of silence is dead, or at least weakened. And now, in the wreckage, a question hangs over humanity. What does a civilization without silence look like? It is almost impossible to imagine, because for as long as there have been humans, there has been silence. Every culture has depended on it, every family has practiced it, every government has weaponized it. It is the hidden architecture of order. But imagine if, for once, we tried to build differently, a civilization of exposure. In this new world, no one can hide behind silence. Families confront abuse when it begins, not decades later. Institutions cannot bury their crimes in locked archives. Governments cannot redact, censor, or classify away the truth. Transparency is not a demand, it is the default. Every act, every deal, every betrayal is visible. It is terrifying, but it is also liberating. Imagine living in a family where every wound is spoken instead of buried, where children are taught that silence is not protection but poison, where secrets no longer metastasize into generational curses. Imagine living in a society where histories are not rewritten to flatter the victors, but told in the voices of those who suffered most. A history that is jagged, uncomfortable, raw, but real. Imagine a politics where no backroom deals exist because the walls are made of glass, where no government can hide its atrocities because the archives are already open, where no lie can metastasize into propaganda because truth arrives instantly, like light breaking through cracks. It would not be a peaceful world. Exposure is painful, truth is destabilizing, but it would be an honest world, and honesty for the first time would be the foundation, not silence, the unbearable noise. But let's not romanticize it. A world without silence would be overwhelming. Constant exposure means constant confrontation. Families would be raw with confession. Communities would be fractured by too much honesty. Nations would tremble under ceaseless revelations. We would drown in voices. Noise would become the new parasite. Not silence, but the endless cacophony of every truth, every pain, every scream, every testimony, a flood that never ends. How would we live inside such noise? Perhaps we would adapt. Just as our ancestors adapted to silence, we would evolve strategies to survive noise, new rituals of listening, new technologies to filter, not to censor but to cope, new practices of collective grieving because truth will wound us daily. We might build new architectures not of repression but of expression. Not to bury secrets, but to carry them together. The question is not whether the noise would hurt. It would. The question is whether the noise might finally cleanse. The Galvin Mirror. Return to the Galvins. What would their story have looked like in this post-silence world? The moment abuse began, it would have been spoken. Not whispered, not buried, not dismissed, but exposed. Authorities would not have looked away because there would be no option to look away. Institutions would not have suppressed it because suppression would be impossible. The weight of truth would have been immense. The family would still have been fractured, but perhaps not destroyed. The parasite would not have been allowed to feed for decades, and maybe, just maybe, their tragedy could have been transformed into survival. That is the promise of a civilization without silence. Not that it prevents all suffering, but that it prevents suffering from festering in the dark, becoming monstrous. The new myths. Civilizations cannot live without myths. But in a post-silence world, the myths would be different. No longer stories of glory built on graves, but stories of survival built on exposure. The heroes of this world would not be conquerors or rulers, but truth-tellers, whistleblowers, survivors, witnesses. The myths we tell our children would not be sanitized victories, but difficult truths about endurance, resilience, and facing what was once forbidden. It would not be a comfortable world. Comfort is the gift of silence. But it might be a just world, the risk of relapse. But here is the danger. Silence is seductive. It offers relief. It offers order. It offers a way to live without drowning in noise. Even in this imagined future, there will be those who long for silence again, who whisper, things were easier when we didn't have to know. And slowly, new silences may creep in, little omissions, little erasures, small secrets justified as protection. The parasite may never truly die. It may always regenerate. And so, perhaps the greatest struggle of a post-silence civilization is vigilance, the constant exhausting effort to keep the floodgates open, to resist the temptation of forgetting, to remember that silence always returns disguised as mercy. Because silence does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with trumpets. It seeps back in slowly, invisibly, until one day the parasite is thriving again, and no one remembers how it happened. The final paradox. So what is the lesson of the says? Galvins. Of silence? Of this apocalypse and aftermath? It is this paradox. Silence destroys, but it also protects. Noise liberates, but it also overwhelms. Civilization without silence might be more honest, but it might also be unbearable. There is no final escape, no perfect cure, only a choice between poisons. But perhaps there is a way forward. Not total silence, not total noise, but a fragile balance. A way to learn when silence protects life and when it destroys it. A way to hold truths without drowning in them. A way to build a civilization that does not feed on silence as a parasite, but uses it sparingly, like medicine. Because maybe silence is not the villain. Maybe silence is like fire. In small amounts, it warms and protects. In excess, it consumes everything. The Galvins were consumed. The question is whether we will be, and if we are not careful, if we fail to recognize silence when it creeps back into our lives, then the flood will return again, because silence always ends. It cannot hold forever, and every time it breaks, the world is remade. The story is over, and yet it isn't, because silence never really ends. It lingers like smoke after a fire, seeping into the walls, clinging to our skin, waiting for the moment we forget it's there. We have walked through history's dark halls together, through the Galvin household where screams were swallowed, through institutions that worshipped order over truth, through the flood of exposure that tore the parasite open. We have imagined the aftermath, a civilization without silence, a civilization drowning in noise. But the question is not about them, not about the Galvins or governments or history. The question is about you. Look around your own life. What silence have you been carrying? What truth is locked behind your teeth, behind your walls, behind your lineage? Maybe it isn't as catastrophic as the Galvins. Maybe it isn't violence or madness or horror, but it doesn't have to be. Even the smallest silence grows teeth if you feed it long enough, because silence eats. It eats years, it eats families, it eats futures, and when it finally breaks, as it always does, it does not break gently. The Galvins are not just a story from the past. They are a mirror, a warning, proof that silence is not absence. It is presence. It is a force, alive, ravenous, patient, a parasite waiting inside us all. And now, as you hear these words, you can feel it, can't you? That weight in your chest, that memory you never speak, that name you avoid, that truth you bury in the night and hope never claws its way out. That is silence. You may believe it protects you, You may believe it holds your world together, but remember, silence is not protection. It is a bargain, and one day the price will come due, so the choice is yours. You can keep feeding it, keep guarding it, keep letting it grow in the dark until one day it ruptures and you, like the Galvins, are left in ruins. Or you can do the unthinkable. You can speak. Not everything, not all at once, but something. A crack in the dam, a fracture in the parasite's grip. A word that says, I refuse to be consumed, because the only weapon against silence is voice. The Galvins never found theirs in time. But maybe you will. And maybe, if enough of us choose voice over silence, truth over shadow, survival over decay, then the parasite will starve. Maybe, for the first time in history, the flood will not destroy us, but cleanse us. That is the ending. And the beginning. The silence is still here, but so are you. So the question is simple. Will you feed it, or will you speak?